Well, we're starting a little late, but thank you for attending the third annual Spriggs Family Lecture. This lecture is funded by the Spriggs Family Endowment for Free Market Studies and sponsored by the College of Business here at Boise State. My name is Alan Dalton. I'm an emeritus faculty in the Department of Economics and the organizer for tonight's lecture. I want to thank all of you for attending, and especially to John Nordstrom for getting all your students up. Before thanking some attendees and introducing tonight's speaker, I'd like to ask you to turn off the music. I'd like to ask you to all silence your cell phones. And even though you think you did it before, like I thought I did it before, I'm going to double check. Okay. In addition, those students who got in for extra credit, if you happen to slip by the desks as you came in and not get an extra credit slip, they'll still be there at the end of QA. That's when they will be collected. If you leave early, I don't guarantee that you're going to get those in the extra credit slip box, okay, because it's not going to be out until after the end of Q&A. So make sure, okay, that you hang around until you see the extra credit box is out. We're going to try to get done at 7:45, even though we're running about 5 minutes late. Also during Q&A, there's 2 microphones. You don't have to do anything. The people in the booth turn them on and off, okay? Ask a question, make it short, no follow-up in case there are people standing behind you who also want to ask a question. And lastly, as you leave, especially from members of the community, if you would like to receive email invitations for future lectures sponsored by the College of Business and Economics or the Economics Department, please leave your name and email on one of the legal pads that are out there on the tables, and we'll make sure you get those on the invitation list. The Spriggs Family Endowment for Free Market Studies was created in 2020 from a generous donation by the family of Scott and Lynette Spriggs to Boise State's College of Business and Economics. The purpose of the endowment is to fund a yearly lecture, bringing a prominent researcher and teacher to Boise to discuss the nature, attributes, and outcomes of market processes. Scott and Lynette are unable to attend tonight, but they said they'd be viewing on the live stream being provided by University TV. So please join me in thanking them for their generous donation. I would also like to recognize Dean Mark Bannister of the College of Business and Economics. Go ahead and stand up, Mark. Okay. His vision and leadership helps make events like this possible for Boise State students and citizens of the Treasure Valley. And last but not least, I would like to thank Ann Walker. Ann, she's the department chair. Department chair of the Economics Department, and I want to thank her for her continuing support of this lecture series. Tonight's speaker is Michael Munger. He's a professor of political science at Duke University. He also holds joint professorships in the economics and public policy departments at Duke. He is also the director of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program, which is an undergraduate interdisciplinary program at Duke. He is a research fellow at George Mason's Law and Economics Center, a senior fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research, and a senior fellow at the Independent Institute. His degrees are mainly in economics. Indeed, as he told us over lunch, his very first class teaching political science was done without ever having taken a political science class. He received his bachelor's degree from Davidson College in North Carolina and his master's and PhD from Washington University in St. Louis. His first teaching job was in the economics department at Dartmouth, followed by appointments in the political science departments at the University of Texas, Austin, and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He has authored 8 books, including 2 on the sharing economy and 1 on tonight's topic, Is Capitalism Sustainable? He has edited 5 other books. He has authored or co-authored over 170 refereed journal articles and monographs. Indeed, his CV is almost as long as the Nobel laureate Vernon Smith's. He's written over 250 book reviews and over 500 opinion editorials, and perhaps the next one will appear in the Idaho Statesman, which he submitted today. He has won multiple teaching awards, is a frequent guest on the podcast Econ Talk, a frequent guest lecturer at campuses throughout the United States. Indeed, he told me he travels practically every week to do this sort of thing. And he also hosts the Apple podcast, The Answer is Transactions Costs. In his free time, he dabbles as a legal expert in election law cases, including the Idaho Republican Party versus USERSA, and is sometimes himself a candidate for public office. Is capitalism sustainable? Please welcome Professor Mike Munger.
Well, hey, thanks very much. I'm glad to be here. I do want to thank all the organizers that have already been mentioned, but it means a lot to me to be able to be here. May I ask that my presentation be put, there we go, thank you very much. Very impressive crowd. I'm worried that you're here under a misconception. I'm not dating Travis Kelce. And for those of you, that's a Taylor Swift joke. It's 2024 and you have to do that. So the question that I ask, is capitalism sustainable? The subtitle, as you see, is Character and the Road to Cronyism. The TLDR is no. Capitalism is not sustainable in a democracy. And I think advocates for capitalism need to recognize that there's a lot of holes in what, until now, they've tried to use definitional defenses of capitalism. It is time, that is, that people who want to defend markets recognize the very valid criticisms that have been made by many on the left. So I want to start with Cicero, which anglicized is Cicero, in his book of Duty. Quintus Scaevola, the son of Publius, when asked to have the price of an estate he was buying named once for all, the seller had complied with his request, said he thought it worth more, and added 100,000 sesterces. Now, I'm going to guess that in the Boise real estate market that this would not be common. I go and I see a house listed for $700,000, and I say, no, this is worth $800,000. And the seller has a heart attack and dies. But there is no one who would say this was not the act of a good man. But men in general would not regard it as the act of a wise man, any more than if he had sold an estate for less than it would bring. This, then, is the mischievous doctrine, regarding some men as good and others as wise. That's one of the problems that capitalism faces, is that we try to maximize profits, they try to get the best deal that they can. We have the idea that good people engage in charity and recognize that they're embedded in a social context that is larger than themselves. The question is whether those two sentiments can be compatible. So Deirdre McCloskey, in her book, The Bourgeois Virtues, asks whether capitalism corrodes or advances civic virtue. So countries where stealing rather than dealing rules become poor and then remain so. It doesn't matter what kind of predation stealing it is. Socialist stealing, private governmental stealing, or stealing at the point of a pen by CEOs in America during the 1990s. Now, this was written in 2004. Presumably, if she does another edition, she will update that to include corporate stealing during the 2020s. By doing evil, we do badly, and we do well when we do good. Commercial societies make virtuous citizens. I think I have to raise a question about that. Do commercial societies require virtuous citizens? Because that would be a very different thing. Israel Kirzner famously talked about the difference between optimization And many of you have had an economics class, and in it you might talk about constrained optimization, where all information is known. Robinson Crusoe on his island was able to optimize. That was true on Thursday. The following day, Friday showed up, and now we have a social problem. The question is, in a social setting, optimization is not enough. What we need is what Kerzner called alertness. Entrepreneurship is alertness, trying to guess ways that other people can be served. So alertness and profit seeking are discovery processes, but at a higher level than prices. So new products and resources exist only in the imagination of the entrepreneur. So the story about how money is made in a capitalist system, the orthodox story, with consumers is also voluntary because no one is required to buy my product. If the amount of revenue that I'm able to get with all of those myriad voluntary contracts with consumers, that's my revenue, I take that money and then I use it to pay off all the contracts with the input suppliers. If the amount of revenues exceeds the amount of input costs, what's left over is a particular special kind of price that economists call profits. Now notice the many different ways that I've made people better off. I've made every one of those consumers better off, and I've made every one of those input suppliers better off. And I had something left over, and if the profits are high, it's a signal that society should devote more resources to that activity. So that's the standard story of capitalism. The question is, does capitalism in the United States work anything like that? Are all those input contracts really voluntary? Are my sales in output markets really voluntary? And are the profits that I earn the result of earning through entrepreneurship, from seeing around corners? Am I able to secure revenue in excess of cost by pursuing honest profits? Or is it something else? So Steve Jobs famously said, you can't just ask customers what they want and then try to give it to them. By the time you get it built, they'll want something new. In the end, for something this complicated, it's really hard to design product by focus groups. A lot of times, people don't know what they want until you show it to them. Henry Ford famously summarized this perspective by saying that if he had asked consumers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Now, presumably, we're better off with cars. I think that's debatable, but let's suppose that we really are better off with cars. Well, that means that the person who took that risk and put together all those inputs and created cars and sold them, those profits were earned. It's okay. Capitalism is working as it should. So I don't want to belabor that point, but I want to make sure you actually know the argument, the standard orthodox argument for capitalism. Now what we have to do is say, is that what we actually observe? So, a kind of theorem. The if part is, if exchanges are voluntary, profits are the excess of revenues over costs, then. Now, voluntary is a word that I made up. I'm not going to say much more about it, but if you want to Google it, it means truly voluntary. Economists always say, since exchanges are voluntary. Well, wait. We should be saying if exchanges are voluntary. So I've tried to define what true voluntarity would require, and it's conditions that are quite a bit beyond what economists would usually say. But, because the prefix EU means well or truly. So if exchanges really are voluntary, and if profits are the excess of revenues over cost in a market without artificial constraints, then entrepreneurship is actually virtuous. It is the habit of the alert seeking of exchange opportunities embedded in a character of forbearance of rent-seeking opportunities. Now, I haven't defined rent-seeking opportunities, but that basically is the ring of Sauron. So rent-seeking is the temptation that threatens capitalism. And it threatens capitalism in a democracy to such an extent that I'm not sure that the argument that I made 5 minutes ago is really sustainable. Hence the title of this talk. So the problem is sustainability, and I don't mean environmental sustainability. I mean, if we have a capitalist system, will it continue to be a capitalist system, or will it be something else? So the owner-manager has a fiduciary duty to earn accounting profits. I have agreed that I will devote my efforts and resources to secure profits for the stockholders of this corporation. Now, there's a variety of legal but immoral means by which I can increase the profits of this corporation. That is, I'm not just a wise man, am I also good? So, one thing that I can do is invest in more plant and equipment. I can raise wages to increase productivity and have workers be happier. I can invest in research and development to produce new products that people want. Or, instead of hiring engineers and customer service people, I can hire lobbyists and friends of US senators who will pass favorable legislation, favorable regulation, tax subsidies, reductions in taxes, all of which are also profitable. Those are also profitable. Now, as a manager, don't I have a fiduciary duty to do those things? Those are legal. There's nothing illegal about that. It is arguably immoral because it violates our textbook notion of what capitalism is. But since it's legal but immoral, suppose that you have a manager of good character who decides to behave virtuously, eschewing rent-seeking opportunities. I know those rent-seeking opportunities are available, but I refuse. It would be wrong. Well, we have a competitive market for managers. If you won't do it, somebody else will. We'll fire you and hire someone else. Notice that that's the essence of competition. If we're competing for managers who can produce the most profits, the capitalist system itself will select for managers who are willing to engage in rent-seeking activities, because the things that I described, subsidies, favorable tax policy, favorable regulation, using government policy to produce artificial profits, because that's what rents are. Rents are artificial profits. If I can use the coercive power of government as a way to increase my profits, instead of doing it the virtuous way, I'm actually obliged to do that by the competitive system of capitalism itself. This is not a Marxist argument. Well, maybe it's not exclusively a Marxist argument. It's certainly consistent with Marx's claim, but that's actually the essence of capitalism. Okay, but maybe the stockholders say, no, as Richard Nixon said, that would be wrong. So what happens is that I'm a corporate raider. I go to a bank, and I say, if you look at the assets of this company is not engaging in rent seeking, which is legal but immoral. If you will loan me $1 billion, I'll buy the company and have you back $1.2 billion by this afternoon, because the stock price will immediately rise to capitalize the new management philosophy of pursuing the legal but immoral rent seeking, which will increase our profits. So, competitive market for managers and a market for mergers and acquisitions, which is likely, just under the logic of capitalism itself, to push us in the direction of cronyism. So, you may remember from Star Wars, Grand Moff Tarkin gets bad news. Commander number 1, we've analyzed their attack, sir, and there is a danger. Should I have your ship standing by? And Governor Tarkin is arrogant. Ha! Evacuate in our moment of triumph? I think you overestimate their chances. Now, remember, in Star Wars, what they were actually talking about was there was a big hole in the Death Star. How did they miss that? There's a big hole that goes all the way to the central reactor core. Yes, there is a problem with their attack. They're trying to drop bombs down the central core and blow up the Death Star. How did defenders of capitalism for so long miss the fact that this argument, which is entirely consistent with capitalism, is an excellent defense? And obviously, I'm not making up anything original. This is an argument that's been made by the left for decades. However, defenders of markets have tried to use a definitional defense. And that's what I'm going to try to describe now. So I'll admit I've done this myself. I have friends who say that they're socialists, and I'll say, look, that doesn't make any sense. Venezuela is what socialism becomes. Socialism, as an economic system at least, not democratic socialism, but political socialism, is a recipe for authoritarianism and economic decline. And yes, socialism might start out different, but it becomes like Venezuela, like Cuba, just economically impoverished and authoritarian. Now, that argument may or may not be right. The point is, it's an often argument made by the right. It's often made by conservatives. So there's socialism, the ideal that can be imagined by people on the left. And then I say, yeah, but what about Venezuela? And they say, oh, well, that's not real socialism. That's a perversion of socialism. Well, if that's what socialism becomes, if you advocate for socialism, you're saying you want Venezuela, and that's probably not true. All right. But then sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, isn't it? This from Medium a while back, I've highlighted in green, a commenter made a pretty innocuous comment. In my opinion, the most important problem of capitalism you didn't mention is lobbying. And the response from Tyler Hogg was, oh, well, that's not capitalism. That's cronyism or corporatism. It's the opposite. Yes, but if that's what capitalism becomes, you can't really say, I'm for the kind of capitalism that I can imagine ideally in my mind. You have to defend capitalism as it actually exists in a democratic society. So, again, talking about Betsy DeVos, there was going to be a monopoly on federal student loans, and Norm Ornstein responds, well, that's not capitalism, that's crony capitalism. Well, it's not a defense. If that's what capitalism becomes, then there really is a problem. So the defense is always, that's not capitalism, that's cronyism. But what if cronyism is an essential feature in any democratic system that tries to be capitalist? And so here, let me perform a little public choice on public choice. Public choice is a particular perspective in political science and economics. And it has some core assumptions. One of the main assumptions in public choice is that we are not allowed, as a matter of method, to assume good intentions and goodwill on the part of government officials as a solution to problems in public finance. So we can't say, well, but we'll hire good people. The system itself has to produce good outcomes. So let's make public choice assumptions. Let's suppose that voters are passive and rationally uninformed, a standard public choice approach. That is, it's difficult for voters to act collectively, and they probably don't know much about the actual workings of policy. Individual corporate CEOs benefit from cronyism. They can increase their profits and they can increase their pay. Individual politicians benefit from cronyism. Well, that's true because they increase both their power and the amount of campaign contributions that they receive in exchange for favorable regulation and tax policy. If those three things are true, capitalism is screwed. Capitalism is going to become cronyism. So if you use the rational choice assumptions of public choice, there is a strong tendency in capitalist society to move towards cronyism. Now, there would be hope. There's a shining light outside. All we need is for these groups to act altruistically. That's the one thing we can't assume. That's the one thing public choice says you can't assume. You cannot assume virtue. We have to have institutions that solve the problem. So famously, Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations, this first paragraph is often quoted, but I wanted to give it in context. People of the same trade seldom meet together even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. It is impossible indeed to prevent such meetings by any law which either could be executed or would be consistent with liberty and justice. Now remember, Adam Smith is supposedly the high priest of capitalism, but this is a pretty scathing indictment because if people of business get together, even for merriment and diversion, they're going to end, the conversation will end in a conspiracy against the public. But then he goes on to say, but we shouldn't require those assemblies because that will result in, he didn't have the word at his disposal, but cronyism. That will result in industry groups that use their political power to secure favorable regulation and lower taxes and subsidies rather than doing it the old-fashioned way by competing. So in other words, a good public-spirited government official won't require meetings or trade associations. Well, we can't blame Adam Smith for not knowing public choice, but the public choice response is, wait, you can't defend capitalism by assuming a benevolent dictator. In a democratic state, we will always want to make such assemblies necessary because it benefits elected officials. So, I'm not that good at pasting things on, but Grand Moff Greenspan gets bad news. We've analyzed their attack, sir, and assuming altruistic CEOs is silly, while invoking a benevolent government violates basic public choice theory. Should we just admit that capitalism is unsustainable? Now, I made that up. That didn't actually happen. But this next thing did. This is an actual quote, famously Alan Greenspan's mea culpa. Those of us who have looked to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself especially, are in a state of shocked disbelief. I still do not fully understand why it happened. Why, what happened? Well, this was in 2009. He was talking about the collapse in 2008 when a lot of large financial institutions had recognized that if they took excessive risk and made money, they got to keep it. If they took excessive risk and lost it, the government would bail them out. What would a rational firm do? Now, a good firm would say, no, that would be wrong. But a rational firm would say, wait a minute, you mean I get to play with house money? I take excessive risks. If I win, I get to keep it. And if I lose, the government will take money at gunpoint from taxpayers and give it to me. I'm gonna do that. So it's a little surprising that defenders of capitalism would have been so naive, and that's basically what Alan Greenspan is saying here. I thought that the threat of bankruptcy would be sufficient to discipline these companies. But why would it be? Why would it be when they can make more money by taking excessive risks? So to distinguish, capitalism is a social system based on the recognition of individual rights, including private property rights, where all goods, both intermediate and final goods, are owned privately. Corporatism is a social system where the government intervenes aggressively into the economy, typically with political instruments that benefit large corporations and enterprises to the detriment of smaller businesses and private citizens. Such instruments include subsidies, tariffs, import quotas, exclusive production privileges, such as licenses, antitrust laws, and compulsory cartelization designs. So, if we were to portray the two extremes, we would have capitalism and socialism, but in fact, neither of those two extremes are likely to exist. More likely, on the left, we'll see all prices managed, all production planned. On the right, we'll see some version of cronyism. Now, the tendency towards at least the middle and the left side of this is not just because there may be some people who politically prefer socialism. It may be because corporate CEOs economically prefer cronyism. There's a tendency to move to the left on this scale, to move away from capitalism. So, all too often, market advocates envision real-world capitalism as retaining many features of their own ideal theory, competitive equilibrium models. So, famously, Solyndra's highly subsidized collapse. Solyndra spent almost $1 billion and didn't build any solar panels. They did, however, have an amazingly awesome climbing wall in the employee cafeteria. It was just great. They were not in money to make solar panels, they were in money to make subsidies, and it worked for a while. Martin Shkreli famously used FDA-approved procedures to squelch competition. So one of the reasons that Martin Shkreli was successful in selling his pills for $800 per pill was that the Obama administration had put sharp restrictions on new firms entering the generic drugs market. This was a generic drug. There was no patent. But Shkreli realized that two things were true. First, It took 2 years for a new company to pass the regulatory hurdles to start making these pills, and the FDA would ask the existing producers if they thought that it was necessary that a new company be brought in given the productive capacity of the incumbents. They said, no, we're doing plenty, as long as it's $800 a pill. And then people, what is the cause of this? Well, it's greed, and it is greed, but it's greed filtered through the political institutions of cronyism. Capitalism, to the extent that it's sustainable, causes the clash of greed to benefit consumers through competition. The point is, though, that that kind of capitalism doesn't seem to be sustainable. The temptation to move to political means is just irresistible. So, to review, businesses maximize accounting profits, not profits of the kind I talked about at the beginning, but accounting profits. If they can get revenues from favorable regulation, they will. Politicians seek to maximize power, including but certainly not limited to re-election probabilities. Voters are poorly organized and poorly informed, rationally because of the collective action problem. Those are pretty standard public choice tenets. But taken together, they mean capitalism is unsustainable and always converts to cronyism. So let me distinguish, just to make sure you understand the difference I'm arguing for. Profits are the excess of revenues from selling a product after legitimate costs are subtracted. If the exchange is truly voluntary, each person buying the product must think she's better off. Entrepreneurs seek profits and therefore create value. Rent-seeking is a competition for an artificial prize or benefit created either by taking money from taxpayers and giving it away, or a restriction on competition that allows an artificial increase in prices. Political entrepreneurs seek rent. No value is created, it's just transferred. The problem is that profit-seeking becomes rent-seeking if the government wants to sell rents instead. And does the government want to sell rents instead? Yes, because it benefits elected officials to do that. We could assume that they are good and virtuous. But there's a problem with that if you're taking a public choice perspective. So if you look at the usual function for profits, we have price times the amount that is produced, which is the production function given the amount of capital and labor used, minus the cost of capital, minus the cost of labor. Now, I can just engage in those things and try to increase my profits. But are any of those subject to control and manipulation by the government? Well, only the things in red. So, price, the production function, the interest rate, and the wage rate. So a rational economic actor is going to recognize that marginal profitability of rent-seeking exceeds, at some point, the returns to the pursuit of honest profit. Even if entrepreneurs forbear, a rational politician is going to recognize that power and electability can be improved by forcing a rent-seeking society on entrepreneurs. So, those of you who had economics recognize there's a marginality condition coming, because there should be. Marginality condition is this: we can invest in engineers and in inventors, and we can invest in lobbyists and rent-seeking specialists with personal connections to legislators and regulators, until the last dollar devoted to each produces an equal increment to accounting profits. The only way capitalism can survive then is if the last dollar devoted to honest profits is still more productive than the first dollar devoted to rent-seeking. Which means, of course, this graph. Vertical axis is marginal profitability. Horizontal axis is investment spending. Now, this is marginal profitability. So we're at the point, these are mature industries, we're at the point where marginal profitability is falling at the margin as investment spending increases. The top curve is declining, but it doesn't decline so much that capitalism is not sustainable. Throughout, playing the game the right way is still more profitable than the first dollar return to lobbying. The horizontal line, to make this simpler, is the first dollar reward to lobbying. The capitalism unsustainable graph is, for a while, companies are going to play it straight. But then their marginal profitability from playing it straight starts to decline. At some point, we equate the cronyism, capitalism, profit return. And then the profitability of capitalism falls below the marginal profitability of cronyism. Now, to make this really work, you'd have to have lobbying as a curve, but my point is, pure capitalism is generally not going to be sustainable. Now, there's a number of reasons why I think the argument that I've made is overly stark and overly pessimistic, but I want to leave it at that so that we can have questions. I do hope that you guys, when you ask questions, feel free just to make comments as long as they're brief. We'll try to get to as many of you as you can. Thanks for your patience, and it was a pleasure talking to you. So I guess line up for questions. And comments are fine.
So I was wondering, how do we create defense mechanisms when, after the 2008 collapse, corporations realized that they could make as much money from profits as they could from losses?
So the question was, what would be a defense mechanism for this, given that large corporations have recognized that losses are not necessarily unprofitable? So the response to the 2008-2009 collapse was Dodd-Frank. And what Dodd-Frank did was dramatically increase the costs of compliance for large firms. So it used to be that if you were a small finance firm, you could be small and nimble. After Dodd-Frank, it took 5 or 6 compliance people just to be able to satisfy the law. Barney Frank was the largest recipient of campaign contributions from Wall Street. And so what we did was make it much worse. After Dodd-Frank, the system is much worse than it was before, because now it is impossible to enter that industry. No new large financial firms can possibly emerge because the compliance cost entry barriers are going to make it even worse. So, in mature industries, and maybe in the finance industry in particular, I'm not sure there's that much hope. But I do think, you said, what are the defense mechanisms? There's some others that I may talk about later, but the simplest is a dynamic economy where we're getting new industries. So mature industries, we're always going to get to the point, and finance is a very mature industry. It's heavily regulated, and they're able to make large campaign contributions. They're making large profits. I don't know what to do about finance. But as long as we're getting new industries, then for a long time, those companies are not participating in politics. They're participating in capitalism. Microsoft, for a long time, didn't have any lobbyists. Now they have almost a full square block on K Street. So as industries mature, you're going to get this process by which they're going to switch over. But as long as we continue to have a dynamic economy where we get new industries, new ideas, and entrepreneurs are being rewarded, we still have a shot of staying ahead. But I'm a little bit skeptical, given the political and economic incentives in finance. That's not very good. Over here.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I've got a couple of questions. The first is...
He's hoping we can have one per customer.
Oh, just one per customer? Oh, okay.
Nobody behind it.
Okay, I'll start with this one then. Would you define Citizens United as like a leading example of rent-seeking behavior in the political realm, where corporations have been given the voice, or this kind of idea of being an individual and having that those kinds of qualities that are protected in our Bill of Rights around an individual acknowledged for corporations?
I actually participated in writing an amicus brief for Citizens United, which actually Chief Justice Roberts used in one of the questions. It seems to me that there's 2 things to say about Citizens United. First, There's nothing about individual or money as speech in Citizens United. If you read the decision, it's about freedom of association. So groups can come together to try to influence politics. They can be parties or they can be corporations. That's fair enough. The decision was going to be written by Chief Justice Roberts, and then it would have been a sensible decision. Citizens United was a nonprofit company. Anthony Kennedy decided he was going to wrest away that and write for the majority and take up the problem of for-profit corporations, which was not even a question that was presented to the court. So as a result of that second step, with Anthony Kennedy saying for-profit corporations can write checks from their treasuries, then yes, it is an example. So it didn't have to be. Citizens United should have been decided. Well, McCain-Feingold was unconstitutional. The not being able to engage in electioneering within 60 days of an election was patently unconstitutional. It should have been dismissed. That's what Citizens United was about. But Anthony Kennedy, for reasons known only to him, and then he was joined by a majority, wrote a decision that changed things in a way that I think we're going to having trouble getting back. So I would join in part in dissent in part from your claim. But yes, the basic answer to your question is yes.
Yes.
And if there's not as many people, then you're welcome to ask another one.
Thank you.
Hi there. I really liked your Star Wars reference. I think that's actually a really good analysis. My question is actually going back to your Star Wars reference, what would be a more, if you were referring to the issues with capitalism as the size of the hole, which, by the way, just to answer, is only about 2 meters, no bigger than a womp rat. How big would...
He used to hit womp rats, though. So.
Yeah, similar to you. You're able to nail that hole. So, random question. If there's a more sustainable, system, how big would the size of that Death Star hole be?
So I said I had other defenses in mind. One thing we need is better voters. And so voters seem to be willing, well, thank you. I'm actually running for the North Carolina General Assembly right now, District 40 in the North Carolina House, and I'm going to come in third because I'm running as a third-party candidate. Of course, I'm going to blame voters instead of my own inadequacies. But the reason we need better voters is that voters are rewarding politicians for allowing and engaging in rent-seeking. So what we need is some sort of information. And if we sometimes publish lists of socially responsible corporations. Why don't we make lists of companies that engage, whose total profits, what proportion of their profits come from political rent seeking? And then, there could be boycotts, there could be all sorts of things that would inform voters, that would overcome the collective action problem. The second thing, I think, is either constitutional or statutory restrictions on the ability of politicians to engage in these activities that we all agree, I think, are harmful. It's not controversial. But voters are going to have to demand that before any politicians are going to run on that sort of platform. So my hope is for better voters and constitutional restrictions. And if we had those things, we could at least make the hole pretty small.
How small?
I'm sorry?
How small?
Yeah. Smaller. I'm a marginalist.
Come on, you gotta have...
It's a big-ass hole now.
It's only 2 meters!
Hi, my name is Laredo, and I'm asking a question about private equity in and of itself. So you talk about the development of cronyism in the United States. Where does private equity sit, currently in its, the sector itself is growing immensely. Where does private equity sit with you right now, and what's the importance of informing the voter about maybe sectors like private equity and the development of cronyism?
Well, we need private equity and sources of liquidity in order to make the capitalist part of the capitalist system work. The problem with private equity is that there's a bunch of artificial restrictions that have made some businesses artificially profitable.
Correct.
And so artificial equity targets those. And one of those in many large cities is the housing shortage. The fact that it's effectively illegal to build affordable housing. Well, that means that rates get jacked up. And you can say because it's because of greed. But housing prices are far higher than they need to be given the lack of the fact that it's illegal to build affordable housing.
Are you talking like townhomes and stuff? How they?
I'm talking about high-density dwellings. So what we need is upzoning and allowing more high-density dwellings. No minimum size restrictions, no setbacks, and get rid of parking requirements. It's very if you're poor and you're going to ride the bus, you don't need to pay for the equivalent of 1.7 parking spaces in that apartment building underneath. So the reason private equity is seeing this as a profit opportunity is there's an artificial restriction to solving the problem the old-fashioned way by building affordable housing. It's literally illegal. So affordable housing, private equity is always going to look for profit opportunities, and it's going to target them in ways that will seem and maybe in some ways be unfair. But we have to recognize that liquidity is the means by which we quickly develop new profit opportunities. And profit, to the extent that it works the way I talked about, is a way of producing new products that we all depend on. So I think the private equity is more of a symptom than it is a cause itself. Although it is a really bad symptom, we may have to treat it, so you're not wrong.
Okay.
Hello, Professor. You seem to be very careful in mentioning that this rent seeking occurs only under, or not only, but under democratic institutions. Do you believe that there's institutions where free markets can thrive absent democracy, and what are they?
You're scaring me. So I said capitalism is not sustainable under democracy, and many people would say, yeah, that's a problem with capitalism. But some people say that's a problem with democracy. What we need instead is a strong man, dictatorship. And an example usually raised in this context is Singapore. Singapore has a dictator, but it has a robustly capitalist system. Well, what about North Korea? They also have a dictator. It's really hard to choose the dictator that you want. So I'm a liberal. Liberalism means that we use rules to grant the autonomy of individuals. The system has to protect the rights of individuals, and one of those rights is participation in self-governance. So I don't know what another system would look like. It has to be democratic, and so we're stuck with that. The notions that, now notice that I elided over, and there's this silly distinction that we often hear, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. That's true, that's fine, we have a constitution, there's a set of restrictions that limit majoritarian power. But in a republic, we can have restrictions on majorities. And one of the ones that I think we need, and it's going to be difficult to formulate, but we need restrictions on rent seeking, on the ability of business to pursue it, and the ability of government to provide it. So to the extent that that's a restriction on democracy, because it is small r Republican, that might be an alternative system.
Hello, Professor. Sorry if I don't ask this question quite eloquently enough, but do you think that rent seeking can also come through the form of a certain type of protection of private property, when it's like the private property over natural resources or specific areas that hypothetically you could control, I guess, limited and non-man-made means of production in an economy, and that's protected by the government as private property?
Well, I think the answer to your question is yes, if I understand, but it's not the primary problem. So the U.S. Forest Service saw as its job the promotion of logging old-growth forests on U.S. federal land. They paid for building the roads in order to make sure that these companies could do it more cheaply. So if you looked at the stumpage rates on private land were actually higher than they were on public lands. So yes, it can happen that private companies might do this, but in the 50s and 60s, the Forest Service was really trying to promote logging by subsidizing it, by having lower costs. So it's not just corporations that do this. We can undervalue natural resources by using majoritarian politics as the metric instead of actually judging the long-run implications. Now, one of the reasons I think your question is a good one is that it's often said that companies that own natural resources have short time horizons, and that's the reason they might overly exploit trees, they might destroy habitat in collecting coal, that sort of thing. I have bad news. Politicians have really short time horizons. If I'm a member of the US House of Representatives, I have a 2-year minus 1 day time horizon, and that's on November 10th. So everybody's focused on the next election. So it's short time horizons generally in politics and in economics. So I would say yes, and yes, you're right that corporations do that, but so do politicians. And so we have a real problem in valuing natural resources because both of the two systems that we use to discover the value of resources, economics and politics, both of those have a short-run bias. So yes, you're absolutely right.
Thank you for your time, Professor, and for your talents and expertise for free to the public. We really appreciate that. My question would be, how do we address possibly the issue where the amount of games we have to play for individuals within the system starts to shrink? What does that look like, or what are your thoughts with that lining up with your presentation tonight regarding capitalism or cronyism? I would try to say it in the sense that maybe for the last 100 years we've had a lot of games out in the field where maybe you're great at game A, you're awful at game B, and vice versa.
Can you give an example?
Maybe the production line. Going back to Henry Ford, quite a few workers on the floor, even though they were given individual responsibilities, you could maximize that responsibility. In theory, I'm going to emphasize theory, maybe it created more games to play. So maybe you weren't the best with the hammer, but you're good with the ratchet. What does that look like as we possibly see? And I don't have an example currently, but I think everybody's ChatGPT. We don't need to go down the AI train, but what does this look like if the amount of games or possibilities out there for individuals that take a role in capitalism starts to shrink in a way that's not necessarily based off of their politics or their engagement within the system as a citizen?
Damn.
I'm trying to put it in a way you can answer it back quickly, but that's about where I'm at with it. So.
You failed then. That doesn't mean it's a bad question. I just can't answer it quickly. So let me give it a shot. My second book on the sharing economy is actually available as for a free PDF download. So you can buy it at its market price of $0 from the Institute for Economic Affairs in London. It's easy to find it. It's just called The Sharing Economy. Prosperity, always, since the beginning of time, has come from one factor, and that's division of labor. Adam Smith thought so, Karl Marx thought so. So by having people specialize and then exchange. Now, the exchange could take the form of cooperative exchange, as in Marx's conception of socialism. It can take the form of exchange on markets. But providing a system that allows people to elaborate division of labor is the way that they're able to become prosperous and have that prosperity widely shared. The difficulty that I see is that the sharing economy has placed a premium on the ability to participate in the digital economy. And so we're starting to see a divergence between people that are computer programming literate and those who are not. And the result may be that if we start sharing, if we start renting rather than owning more things, if we find ways to commodify excess capacity, that the games are really going to diverge, and people that are playing, I went to high school and I want to work in a manufacturing job, there's not much for them. And I think there's two problems with that. One is that in economic terms, those disparities are hard to justify morally. But more immediately, and this is just hypothetical, it could never actually happen, but a political demagogue might exploit the fact that people are upset with what they see as their economic precariousness. And as a result, win elections and then blame someone. That has always been the mechanism. It's not you, you're okay, it's these, and then something. So both on the merits, and political demagoguery mean that this divergence and the foreclosing of some of the more productive games from people who don't happen to have enough ability to participate in the digital economy means that they're not going to be able to engage in the kind of division of labor that will allow them to keep up.
I would desperately like to ask you a follow-up. Is that possible?
It is possible afterwards.
Do you believe that there is any system of economics and or politics that is sustainable regardless of the morality of the leadership who implement and enforce those systems?
So the question is there a system where having no sense of virtue from leaders would still be sustainable? I think the answer is probably not. Part of this is my own mea culpa. Having taught economics and public choice for a long time, I have long said that we don't need good people, we need good rules, as if that could make up for it. We actually need good people. That's a lie. Good rules and good people would be an excellent idea. So if you take an ethics class in business school, probably what you're going to read is a number of cases about how not to get caught doing that thing. Not about not doing that thing, about how not to get caught doing that thing, which seems problematic. But now I just sound like an old-style Tory or an Aristotelian virtuecrat. We should be worried about the problem of virtue, and we should try to nurture and foster institutions that create that sense of virtue and shared fate, that we are all in this together and we're part of something larger than ourselves. That's not something economics has been very good at doing. In fact, to the contrary, a lot of advocates for economic systems have not advocated for that. So no, but I don't think that we have to. I'm hoping we can move back towards more balance between systems and private virtue.
Yes, sir. Professor, thank you for your time. The question I have is, would term limits of politicians lower or even dissolve the possibility of cronyism by eliminating or minimizing one of those three altruisms to cronyism or rent-seeking that you were talking about earlier?
I think term limits are an interesting question. I am very skeptical of term limits because there's an amount of power that's wielded by government. And if we have people who can say only serve 2 terms, they don't acquire enough expertise to be able to run the institutions of government, committee chairs, subcommittee chairs. There's a lot of expertise required in government. If they don't do it, then the committee staff will do it. So term limits will empower what, I don't want to say deep state, the permanent employees of the government. And it's not clear to me that that's a better solution. However, to the extent that it would be possible to have norms of professionalism that would make people say, no, that's wrong, we don't engage in that sort of rent, it might be a solution. So I think my knee-jerk reaction to it is, 20 years ago, political scientists, when you look at Congress, a lot of the power lies in committee chairs and subcommittee chairs who have been in that same jurisdiction for a long time and have expertise about the way the system works. That's not nearly as important now. So I think the argument for term limits is better than it was. I'm still not persuaded by it. But if you really are worried about what some people call, right or wrong, the deep state, there is an argument for term limits, a better one than there used to be.
Howdy, Professor.
Hey.
You mentioned that capitalism...
You're worrying me. You've got a book.
I'm just taking notes. You mentioned how capitalism moves to crony capitalism. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but hopefully this is a simple question with a simple answer. How do we reverse capital cronyism in our economy, so to say?
New industries. The only answer that I can think of is new industries. Once an industry becomes dependent on cronyism, then we're kind of stuck. So Mansur Olson, in his book, The Rise and Decline of Nation, talked about interest group sclerosis. So the political system becomes sclerotic because it's made all these promises to rent seekers. And of course, then they depend, that's been capitalized in the value of their assets. If you take away the rents, they go bankrupt. They're willing to fight forever. These are really powerful political forces. And so I think we would have to do it starts now, it starts changing now. And for new industries, try to resist the temptation for rent seeking. But that means that we're stuck with all of the existing industries because it's very difficult to change once sclerosis has set in.
Thank you.
Yeah, name a political hero that you have on the left and a political hero that you might have on the right.
It's going to piss y'all off. My political hero on the left is Bill Clinton. Now, morally, maybe not that admirable a guy, but when he was told in 1993 and 1994 that his plans for spending would not be possible because it would increase the deficit, he said, okay. And they balanced the budget. They actually recognized that deficits are future taxes. Neither of the two parties now recognize that deficits are future taxes. US policy is DAFT, D-A-F-T. Deficits are future taxes. We're imposing an enormous tax on future generations that either are too young to vote or maybe aren't even born. So Bill Clinton, for all of his flaws, said, we're going to get rid of the wasteful parts of the welfare state. He tried to do a number of things that if I didn't know he was, well, I don't know if he was on the left. I'm not sure a lot of Democrats would claim him, but that relatively left. It's even worse on the right in terms of y'all being disappointed. Bob Michaels, who was the the minority leader of the US House, who was a Republican from the Midwest, was mostly interested in trying to pass the best legislation that they could get by. So I'm a libertarian. I'm a registered libertarian in terms of political party, but I'm a directionalist, not a destinationist. I would like for us to try to choose policies that make things better at the margin rather than trying to implement my particular libertopia and then feeling proud of my irrelevance, of which libertarians have a great deal to be proud.
Thank you, Professor, for your time. So you kind of answered this already with saying that we need good people and good rules. Do you think nonprofits are the answer to sustainability? Thanks.
Nonprofits are more of an answer than they were. One of the ways that we have elaborated division of labor is by using market transactions to be able to compensate people. But Wikipedia, for example, is a really great example of large-scale cooperation that is being organized digitally and not by markets. So people participate in tool libraries, for example, where they just share things. So the ability to share things without using market transactions to organize them mean that something like nonprofits are probably going at least to expand. I don't know that it's going to be a replacement, but the small cooperative groups are likely to expand as the ability to use apps in the sharing economy improves. So on my podcast, the answer is transaction cost, or TITC, T-A-I-T-C. The most recent version of it was about distributed economic resources. So nonprofits in local neighborhoods that allow local communities to generate and consume electricity without actually having to worry so much about the grid. So I'm optimistic that nonprofits will at least expand because of the use of apps and digital means of reducing transaction costs. So our time is almost up. I'm going to ask that the four of you each ask your questions because I would rather hear your questions than my answers. So please.
Thanks for coming. I enjoyed your presentation. So I'm listening to what you're saying and making some inferences, and it seems to me that you're suggesting, and I'm again making inferences, that the solution is to tinker with the system and add regulations that prevent or restrict cronyism. And then I got tripped up a little bit when you said that maybe we need more opportunity for low-income housing, and maybe we should ease restrictions on setbacks and parking. And I want to live in a community that has ample parking and green spaces and setbacks. So in my view, a developer who wants to build without those things is the good, and it may be in your view, it's the virtuous. So it brings me to the question of who defines what cronyism is, and how do we decide what the right regulations are?
Thank you.
My question pertains to voters.
Can you talk a little louder?
Yeah, my question pertains to voters and Madisonian democracy. I'm currently reading a book called The Framers' Coup by Michael Klarman, and he states that essentially the framers launched a coup against the people. They built the the government based on the fact that the public needs to be kept out of the government and should be ruled by the responsible men who need to be protected from the trampling and roar of the public. I was just curious how we could have better voters in capitalist America.
It is certainly true that many of the institutions of American government are anti-majoritarian. I don't share the view that that is against the people. It's actually protecting people against majorities is a means of protecting individuals. That doesn't mean that our system is right. But there are certainly people who entertain that view.
Thank you for your presentation and thank you for your time. I was wondering what you think of breaking apart large states or large cities as a means of combating cronyism, because it'd be more difficult for people to make those deals if they're in a smaller political unit where more people know each other within a city or within a small state.
James Madison in Federalist Number 10 made the argument that it's actually hard. So but it is, again, it's possible. I guess I am more sympathetic to that than I used to be, just like with term limits.
Curious if you think there's any such thing as virtuous rents. In particular, I'm thinking about patent and trademark protection that encourages entrepreneurs to invest in those products that will benefit society.
Sure, virtuous rents are those that I agree with. And that's a completely inadequate answer, and I apologize. But it means that when it comes to intellectual property, ideas want to be free. There's two, at least, words for free in Latin. One is libre, where it can go everywhere. An idea, once it is formed, can go everywhere and benefit everyone. Gratis means that I don't have to pay anything for it. So the question is, how can we make ideas libre but not gratis? And so things like trademarks, copyrights, patents, I think those aren't perfect. I think that the patent system is now being manipulated by pharmaceutical companies. It could be shorter. There's a bunch of problems with the way that we have patents, and it's not accidental because the pharmaceutical companies have recognized that they can be more profitable by getting better patent treatment rather than actually trying to find new drugs that cure diseases that right now only a few people have. So there's nothing irrational about it from a profit perspective. But once you actually, almost everybody agrees that some are good, some are bad, it's actually coming up with it that's the problem. So the last question from this side.
So my question was, you talked about, I think the main defense mechanism that you proposed was constitutional safeguards.
And good voters.
Yeah, but that is kind of like...
Don't be mean.
Mostly out of our hands. But I would say that there are already constitutional safeguards, that Congress doesn't have the authority to do 90% of what it does. So would you say that either maybe making stricter constitutional safeguards that they couldn't twist that way, or maybe getting different judges in that would interpret it?
You raise a sore point. It is true that no constitutional safeguards can long survive determined majorities. So the Supreme Court is insulated in many ways from majorities, but as we saw, what the process that resulted in the Dobbs decision was a movement over time to overtake the Supreme Court with majoritarian sentiment, or at least strongly felt minoritarian sentiment. And so constitutional restrictions also can be overrun. But at the margin, I think it would make it more difficult. And I am serious about, we need to embarrass companies that do this. So making it more embarrassing by publicizing it might give voters something to attach to. But really, we need constant new industries. And actually, we've done pretty well on that lately. And our time is more than up, so thank you very much. You guys are awesome. I am happy to send this PowerPoint to anyone who wants it if you want these details. So munger@duke.edu. Munger, M-U-N-G-E-R, @duke.edu. Just send me an email. Thank you.